The sprawling Whitlock estate stood amidst the rolling hills of Suffolk, its Gothic architecture exuding a sense of timelessness. Yet, beneath its grandeur lay secrets dark enough to stain its stone walls. The estate's crowning feature was the ash tree that loomed just outside the library window, a towering, gnarled figure with branches like skeletal arms stretching toward the heavens. Young Edward Whitlock returned to the ancestral estate after the sudden death of his uncle, Sir Richard Whitlock, a reclusive scholar. Edward, an ambitious lawyer from London, had inherited the property and was eager to settle affairs. The townsfolk, however, were less enthusiastic about his return. Whispers of curses and unnatural occurrences had long been associated with Whitlock Hall and, particularly, the ash tree. On his first evening at the estate, Edward wandered into the library, where the scent of aged leather and dust hung heavy in the air. A journal lay open on the desk, its pages filled with his uncle's neat handwriting. It spoke of unsettling dreams, shadowy figures, and an unnatural obsession with the ash tree. "There is something ancient about the tree," Sir Richard had written. "I hear whispers on the wind, see shapes in the moonlight. It is no ordinary tree." Edward dismissed the journal as the ramblings of an isolated man, but unease lingered as he explored the property. The ash tree seemed to cast a shadow even in the brightest sunlight, its presence oppressive. Servants avoided it, refusing to speak of the strange sounds they claimed to hear at night, rustling branches that mimicked the rasp of whispers. One night, Edward awoke to a sharp knock at his window. He bolted upright, staring at the glass. Beyond it, the ash tree's branches swayed unnaturally despite the still air. He shook off the incident, blaming it on fatigue and a vivid imagination. But the dreams began that night. Edward found himself standing beneath the ash tree in his dream, its branches coiling like serpents. A voice, low and guttural, echoed in his mind, whispering his name. He awoke drenched in sweat, his heart pounding as if he'd run miles. Determined to understand the tree's strange influence, Edward delved into the estate's archives. He uncovered a chilling story. Centuries earlier, Sir Geoffrey Whitlock, one of his ancestors, had condemned a local woman, Eliza Strang, for witchcraft. She was accused of consorting with dark forces and poisoning the land. As she was burned at the stake, her final curse rang out. "The Whitlocks shall never know peace. My vengeance will take root, and my shadow shall linger eternal." Shortly after her execution, the ash tree sprouted near the site of her death, growing rapidly and unnaturally. Generations of Whitlocks had reported strange occurrences, sudden illnesses, unexplained deaths, and sightings of shadowy figures near the tree. That evening, the storm of the century rolled over Suffolk. Thunder roared, and lightning illuminated the ash tree in sharp, flickering bursts. Edward stood at the window, staring at the tree, when a flash of lightning revealed something that froze his blood. Figures twisted, humanoid shapes were clinging to the tree's branches, their hollow eyes fixed on the house. Their forms seemed to shift between solid and shadow, and their mouths moved in a soundless chant. Edward grabbed a lantern and rushed outside, determined to confront whatever haunted his family. As he approached the tree, the wind howled, carrying a sickly sweet odor. The ground beneath the tree was riddled with roots that seemed to pulse like veins. Suddenly, the figures descended, their forms solidifying into grotesque, spider-like creatures with elongated limbs and shriveled faces. Edward swung the lantern, its light scattering the creatures momentarily, but they regrouped, their movements jerky and unnatural. Desperate, Edward recalled a passage from his uncle's journal about fire being the only way to cleanse the curse. He ran back to the house, grabbed a can of kerosene, and returned to the tree. The creatures swarmed, but Edward, fueled by adrenaline, doused the roots and lit a match. The flames roared to life, consuming the tree in an inferno. The creatures screamed, their forms disintegrating into ash as the fire climbed higher. The wind carried their cries, a haunting melody that echoed into the night. As the tree collapsed into a smoldering heap, Edward noticed something buried in its roots, a charred skeleton clutching a silver locket. Inside the locket was a portrait of Eliza Strang, her eyes filled with defiance even in death. The ash tree's destruction marked the end of the Whitlock curse. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the estate seemed brighter, freer. Edward left Whitlock Hall, vowing to sell the property and leave its dark legacy behind. But as he packed his belongings, he noticed a small sapling growing in the corner of the garden, an ash tree. Its leaves rustled softly, though there was no breeze. Edward shuddered, knowing some roots run too deep to be severed. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a fiery glow over the coastal town of Carrow End. Once a thriving port in the 18th century, it had since become a quiet village where fishermen and artisans eked out a living. Yet, the serenity of Carrow End masked a dark history whispered in hushed tones by the elders, the tale of the Negotium perambulans, a shadow that walked the earth, sowing terror wherever it roamed. Lydia Farrow, an urban archaeologist, arrived in Carrow End to study the town's ancient church, St. Anselm's Chapel. The chapel, perched on a cliff, was rumored to have been built atop a site of pagan worship. Its crumbling walls bore strange inscriptions, and the air inside carried a chill that no sunlight could banish. Lydia rented a small cottage on the edge of the village. Her neighbors were cordial but guarded, and whenever she mentioned the chapel, they grew quiet, their faces clouded with unease. One evening, as she reviewed her notes, a knock came at the door. An elderly man stood on her doorstep, clutching a weathered leather journal. His eyes were clouded with age, but sharp with urgency. "You shouldn't be poking around St. Anselm's," he warned. "That place is cursed. The shadow walks there." Intrigued, Lydia invited him in. The man introduced himself as Edward Cray, a retired historian who had spent his life documenting the lore of Carrow End. He handed her the journal, its pages filled with accounts of strange disappearances, livestock slaughtered under the full moon, and sightings of a shadowy figure moving through the fog. "It's the Negotium perambulans," Edward said gravely. "The thing that walks. It's been here since long before the chapel was built. If you value your life, leave." Ignoring Edward's warnings, Lydia continued her work. In the chapel's crypt, she discovered a stone tablet bearing an inscription in an archaic language. Translating it proved difficult, but she managed to decipher a fragment. "The shadow walks, unbound by light or stone. Beware the hour of stillness." That night, Lydia dreamed of the chapel bathed in moonlight. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to swallow the darkness. Its presence filled her with a dread so profound it choked her. She awoke gasping, her heart pounding in her chest. The village grew restless. Fishermen spoke of nets coming up empty, their ropes severed as if by unseen hands. A shepherd found his flock slaughtered, their bodies arranged in a circle on the moor. Edward visited Lydia again, his face pale. "It's awake," he whispered. "The Negotium perambulans stirs when the veil between worlds thins. And you've disturbed it." Determined to uncover the truth, Lydia returned to the chapel with Edward. They discovered a hidden chamber beneath the crypt. Inside, the walls were covered with carvings depicting a monstrous figure consuming the souls of men. At the center of the room stood an altar, stained with what appeared to be ancient blood. "It's a seal," Edward murmured. "The altar binds the shadow. But it's weakening." That night, a dense fog rolled into Carrow End, muffling all sound. The village lay in an unnatural silence, the hour of stillness. Lydia stood by her window, her breath fogging the glass. A movement in the distance caught her eye. A shadowy figure loomed at the edge of the village. It moved unnaturally, gliding without footsteps, its form shifting like smoke. Lydia grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, her curiosity outweighing her fear. As she approached, the air grew icy. The figure turned, revealing a face that was both featureless and horrifying, a void that seemed to draw her in. She stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from her hands. The figure advanced, its presence oppressive and suffocating. Suddenly, Edward appeared, clutching an ancient talisman. He chanted in a language Lydia couldn't understand, the words resonating with power. The shadow recoiled, letting out a soundless scream. "Get back to the chapel!" Edward shouted. Lydia and Edward raced to the chapel, the shadow pursuing them. Inside, Edward placed the talisman on the altar and began a ritual, his voice shaking but resolute. The shadow burst into the chapel, its form writhing as if in pain. "Lydia, the tablet!" Edward cried. Realizing what he meant, Lydia grabbed the stone tablet and placed it beside the talisman. The inscriptions began to glow, and the shadow let out a deafening roar. With a final, blinding flash of light, the figure disintegrated, leaving only silence in its wake. The next morning, the fog lifted, and the villagers emerged cautiously from their homes. Edward was gone, leaving only his journal behind. Lydia, shaken but determined, decided to stay in Carrow End, vowing to protect its secrets. The chapel was sealed, its dark history buried once more. Yet, on quiet nights, Lydia could still feel the weight of unseen eyes watching from the shadows, a reminder that the Negotium Perambulans was never truly gone, only dormant, waiting for the veil to thin again.